Welcome and thank you for joining our webinar today, Protect Privileged Active Directory Credentials Using a Tiered Administrative Model, featuring guest speaker, IT and security expert Russell Smith. You're also joined by BeyondTrust Product Manager Jason Silva, who will run us through a brief overview of BeyondTrust PowerBroker for Windows solution after Russell's portion, so please stick around for that. My name is Sarah, your webinar host today. A kind reminder to please submit your questions via the chat box in the GoToMeeting console anytime throughout the webinar, and we'll cover your questions at the end during our Q&A time. So anytime you have a question, just pop it on in, and I will be monitoring those throughout. Also, today's session is being recorded, and all those who registered and attended today's session will receive a link to the recording and the slides shown here today within 1 to 2 business days from now. So at this point, I'd like to welcome Russell to the line. Hello, Russell, and take it away.
Thanks, Sarah, for the introduction, and welcome to today's session. So my name is Russell Smith, and I'm an independent IT consultant, and I specialize in the security and management of Windows Server. A little bit about me before I start the main part of today's presentation. So, as I said, I'm a writer and a trainer over at Pluralsight, so you can find some courses by me there on Active Directory and Azure. I blog every week for the Petri IT knowledge base, lots of different stuff there about Windows Server. If you're particularly interested in Windows Server security, you'll also find stuff by me in the archives over at the Windows IT Professional website, and I also blog every month for Netrix. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the problem that probably many of you are facing in your environments, and that is the problem of people being able to hack a device and use that device to move across your network. So what exactly do I mean by that? So one of the problems that we have with Windows devices is that users are very often logged on as local administrators. And the problem with this is that those devices can become easily infected with malware. Once that malware takes hold, a hacker is then able to harvest or collect, if you like, the credentials of any users that have previously logged onto that device. So for instance, you may not think it's a problem for a standard user in your environment to log on to Windows with administrative privileges, but it does become a problem, for instance, if a domain administrator has previously logged onto that machine or logs onto that device after it has been infected with malware. So there are at least 2 ways which malware can get those credentials of a privileged user. They can either take those from the cache credentials that Windows remembers for that user, or they can use something like a keylogger, for instance. Now, of course, once the hacker has got those details, they are able to potentially use that information to log on to a different device. Now, at worst, that could, of course, be a domain controller, but it could be any sensitive system within your organization. There are, of course, more sophisticated methods of getting access to a device with more sensitive information. For instance, using pass the hash or pass the token methods, but they all require that initially the user on that device has local administrative access. So how do we go about preventing that problem? Well, of course, there are a whole layer of solutions here, not just one. It's all about defense in depth. So, of course, we don't recommend that you allow users to log on to Windows with administrative privileges. That is the first step. But going beyond that, we also recommend that you should keep all of the privileged groups in Active Directory empty most of the time. Now, I wouldn't mind betting that a lot of people on the call today, if I open up your Active Directory and have a look at the domain admins group, that there will be a whole host of different accounts in that group. Now the domain admins group and other privileged groups in AD should remain empty most of the time and only be populated when you need to perform administrative tasks on your domain controllers. What I will speak in more detail about in a few minutes is structuring your Active Directory so that it uses a tiered administrative model, and I'll explain exactly what I mean by that in the upcoming slides. Restricting the use of accounts, for instance, domain administrator accounts, not only should the domain admins group only be populated when you need it, but when you do have an active domain administrator account, you should restrict where that account is used. And I'll also talk a little bit today about how you can restrict those accounts in the sense of using a privileged access workstation to manage your domain controllers. But I'll explain a bit more about that later. And finally, and this comes back to the tiered administrative model, is that you should never use domain admin accounts or any other kind of privileged account in Active Directory to log on to devices that are not secured to the same level as your domain controller. So I'll explain the different tiers of the model in a second, but basically what this means is that Tier 1 and Tier 2 devices are devices that are not secured to the same level as your domain controllers. So those devices, Tier 1 and Tier 2, should never be used with privileged Active Directory accounts. So how do we know what a privileged Active Directory account is exactly? We understand about the domain administrators group, but you might be surprised to learn that there's a whole load of other privileged groups in Active Directory. So you can see at the top of the slide there, I've highlighted the three most common privileged groups that we're probably all aware of. So of course you've got enterprise, domain, and schema admins. But as you can see, there are a whole load of other groups there. So things like print operators, they actually have privileged access to domain controllers. So if you're using print operators to manage printers in your domain, then you're also giving those users privileged access to Active Directory. Now at the end there you can see that I've said other delegated groups with effective Tier 0 access. So Tier 0 is basically all of your domain controllers and any groups and users that are allowed to control those domain controllers. Now of course you can use delegation in Active Directory to give groups and users effective privileged access to your domain controllers. That is something that you have to manually configure. It's not something that's there out of the box. But if you have done that in your domain, then you should also bear in mind that those groups and users may also have privileged AD access. So, how do we go about actually securing our domain so that hackers can't laterally move across the network with those privileged credentials? So there are three phases to securing your Active Directory. So the first phase, and this is not a comprehensive list of all the things that you should do, but it's probably the most important things that you should do as part of the first phase. So your IT staff should have separate administrative accounts for logging on and administering domain controllers. Okay, so those two things should be separated: administering domain controllers and doing other administrative work in your IT environment. I've briefly mentioned Privileged Access Workstations, and this is part of the tiered administrative model, if you like. And these are workstations that are designed specifically for logging on as a domain administrator. So part of this model is that we don't want you logging on with privileged accounts to an end user's workstation, for instance, because the end user's workstation isn't secured to the same level as a domain controller. So what makes a privileged access workstation special? These workstations are secured to exactly the same level as your domain controllers. So when you log onto them with a privileged account, you can be sure that they are secured properly, no internet access, no email browsing, all those things are blocked, and you can't do anything risky on those devices. And also part of the first phase is that you should set unique passwords on all of your workstations and servers. And Microsoft has a tool to do that called LAPS, and you can use that to set unique passwords on all of your devices. And this also helps to stop lateral movement across workstations and servers. If you have the same administrator username and password on every device, it only takes the hacker to find out, obviously, one password, and they've got access to your entire network. Now the second phase gets a little bit more complicated. So you can see all the simple stuff there really in the first phase, which probably most organizations could realistically achieve. But the second phase is going to require a higher level of technical knowledge and probably more funding. So here again are just a few of the things from the second phase. So as I said, no permanent administrators in your privileged AD groups. Now you can deploy a system for populating those groups, for instance just-in-time access, which you can do with Microsoft products if you want, and that's basically just the concept of populating those groups just in time or at the moment that those privileges are required and for no longer. And as soon as the job is done, you just take those privileges away. You can add extra security to those admin accounts by adding multi-factor authentication, and if you need to perform regular maintenance on domain controllers, for instance, you can use just enough administration where you give just particular rights to do a specific task, and that works using PowerShell. And the third and final phase is of course even more complicated, and probably not many organizations are going to achieve this. But this basically involves implementing Microsoft's enhanced security administrative environment, and this architecture allows for security controls that aren't possible or easily configured in a single forest environment, even one that's managed with privileged access workstations. You should apply code integrity policies to all of your Windows Server 2016 DCs. In fact, you can only do that on Windows Server 2016, so that means you would need to upgrade all of your domain controllers. And if you're using virtual domain controllers, you should use shielded VMs, which again is a technology that you only have in Windows Server 2016. So there are the three phases, and of course the third phase there being the most complicated, but even just being able to establish what's mentioned there in the first phase would significantly improve your security posture. If you want to have a look at the complete roadmap, you can see that there with the URL. So what is the tiered administration model? So it fits into the roadmap as I've just mentioned, and this is basically separating the administration of things like domain controllers from end user workstations. And there are actually 3 tiers. It's not very complicated in principle, and you'll see how those 3 tiers work in a second. So part of the administrative model is also to restrict the devices on where we use our privileged accounts. So we're not going to use privileged accounts on end user workstations, and we're going to restrict where those privileged accounts can be used. So the first tier is basically, as I said, limited to domain controllers and other assets that manage those domain controllers. So for instance, Tier 0 administrators who will be using domain admin privileges to log on to those DCs periodically to perform maintenance tasks. And these administrators in this tier, they can manage domain controllers and any other systems that have effective control of it. So they can manage and control assets at any level. And this basically allows them to have restricted access just to this level, so they're not able to get access to, for instance, or log on interactively to a workstation. So they're restricted in the OU organizational structure like this. The next level is Tier 1, and here you have your member servers and your line of business applications. Again, these Tier 1 administrators, they also go into this tier. So the tiers are not just about devices, they're also about groups and users that manage this level. So these administrators, they can only manage what's in this level, and they can only interactively log into these Tier 1 devices as well. They can't interactively log into a Tier 0 device or a Tier 2 device. And finally, we add the next tier, which is all of our workstation, printers, and any other devices that doesn't fall into the upper two tiers. And these administrators in this tier, they can manage enterprise desktops. Again, they can only manage and control assets at the Tier 2 level, and they can access assets at any level they want for a network logon, but they can only interactively log on to assets trusted at the Tier 2 level. So how is all of this achieved? How is all of this separation of administration achieved? I'll show you in a minute when we have a look at the demo at the OU structure that Microsoft propose that you use to achieve this, and it's all achieved basically through delegation of administration and through group policy. We also have our Privileged Access Workstations, and as I said before, they're a Tier 0 asset, and they're secured to the same level as our domain controllers. And in order to get information about how to configure them, you can see there Microsoft's setup instructions. It's quite a comprehensive list of instructions. It will take quite a long time to go through, but you get a complete list of how you would configure a Privileged Access Workstation. And the OU structure and the groups and everything that we need to set up this tiered administration, you can actually create all of this using a series of scripts. And those scripts are found under the link that you can see there on the slide, the Privileged Access Workstation content scripts they're called. But this is actually to set up that OU structure for tiered administration. So the terminology that Microsoft using is a little bit confusing. So what exactly do these scripts do? So what you'll get in your Active Directory once you've run the scripts is something a little bit like this. So you'll get 6 new top-level organizational units. You can see there on the slide. And you'll get a series of new groups. Now again, I'll show you all of this in a minute in a quick demo, and it's quite a comprehensive OU structure that they create with these scripts, but you can adapt it for your own needs, and it's just recommended as a starting point for you. And as well as the OUs and the groups, we also get a series of group policy objects. Now unfortunately, the scripts don't create these group policy objects. You will need to create them and link them to the necessary OUs yourself. There is just one restriction to that, and that is the poor outbound restrictions. And there is a template of firewall settings that you can import into a group policy object to create this one automatically. But if you go back to those instructions, to that link on the 2 slides back. There's a whole list of instructions about how to create these group policy objects. It's quite a long process, but you can create them manually and you can link them to the OUs, as you can see in the slide there. So I'm going to show you now what this OU structure actually looks like. I'm just quickly going to swap over to my virtual machine. Just give me 1 second. Hopefully within a few seconds you'll see that. Okay. So as you can see here, I'm just going to minimize some of this. You can see the 6 top-level OUs that you don't have in Active Directory out of the box there. And of course we've got a couple of other things there, like the standard users container and things that are just there by default. So I'm just going to quickly show you around this. So you can see the 3 tiers here, and if I expand that, we've got things like accounts. So I'm logged in at the moment with my Privileged Access Workstation accounts. We've got devices, so we're actually seeing here not domain controllers, because we don't move domain controllers from the default domain controllers OU, but any other devices which are going to be added to tier 0, which of course also includes Privileged Access Workstations, because they need to be configured with the same level of security. Now I've added a couple of extra OUs here, which I'll explain a little bit later. You can see here that there are also other things like service accounts we can add, and tier 0 servers if you happen to have anything else you want to configure and classify as tier 0. But as you can see, there's quite a lot there. It's not necessary to keep it all, and you've basically got something very similar for your other 2 tiers. So if I come down here, we've also got tier 1 servers, so you can also see that Microsoft have created different organizational units for different kinds of servers. Again, this is very flexible. You can just get rid of that, or you can add to it for your own organization. It's very flexible. Again, it's just a starting point. We've got user workstations. Again, you can do whatever you like with that in principle. It's the top level OU that's most important in terms of following Microsoft's instructions for creating this model. And we've got another OU here, and you can see here that I've got all of my users in there. And again, it's all pretty straightforward. But what's really complicated about this is not the actual OU structure, but understanding where to put your different assets. So what you have to really understand is what risk level are these assets. So is it tier 0, tier 1, tier 2? Once you've decided the risk level, then you have to decide, well, who is going to control those assets? And then once you've decided who is going to control those assets and also put those assets in the right tier, like your groups and your user accounts, then you have to be sure, well, I need to make sure that these user accounts don't log on, for instance, to workstations. And in those group policy objects, you can make sure that people who, for instance, have tier 0 administrative privileges are not allowed to interactively log on to your workstations. You can actively block that with group policy. So it's not just a model, it's also enforcement of that model as well. Okay, so all of this is very well, and I said, well, okay, you need to keep your privileged Active Directory groups empty most of the time. Now, of course, there are ways you can do that. You've got, for instance, the privileged identity management systems. Microsoft has its own identity manager, and it has various technologies in Windows Server that allow you to control group membership. And again, that is probably something that some organizations that have the resources to deploy all of that might be able to achieve. But if you're at the other end of the scale, how are you going to manage that effectively, and how are you going to enforce it? So I'm just going to come back to the slides. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so I'll just switch in slide there. Hopefully you can see the next slide. So how do we actually manage these privileged AD groups? Well, one method that you can use if you don't have the means to deploy anything more sophisticated is that you can create an OU that will control the group membership of those three main privileged groups. So domain and enterprise and schema admins, and any nested subgroups if you have any nested subgroups. Okay. You can also move any groups that you have maybe nested into any of the built-in privileged AD groups like server operators or backup operators. And you can also move them into your controlled OU. And of course, any other group that you have delegated privileged access to in Active Directory. So why move those particular groups to a controlled OU? Because we can delegate control of that OU to a unique set of accounts, and I'm going to call them directory service management accounts, and only those accounts are allowed to populate those privileged groups. So for instance, if you need to add a user to the domain administrators group, then somebody will need to acquire the password for a directory service management account, log on, and they will need to modify group membership of domain admins, and then when that work has been completed, remove the user from the domain admins group. Okay, so nobody else will be able to do that apart from people who have access to directory service management accounts. And these accounts, they can be disabled most of the time, and you need to have some kind of process to give access to the password for those accounts. Okay. What else can you do to make sure this works? So I've said about moving the domain, enterprise and schema admins and some other nested groups, but why not move things like backup operators or account operators? Why not move them to a controlled OU? And the answer to that is because you cannot move them. They are part of the built-in container in Active Directory, and you cannot move them. But if you have access to Active Directory properly delegated, nobody will be able to add users into those groups, but of course you should audit their group membership on a regular basis. Some of these built-in groups like print operators, as I said, they have access to domain controllers, and I recommend that you don't use these groups if possible, and that you remove any privileges to the domain controllers that they have by default. Okay? They have those privileges by default. Why? Really just for the sake of backwards compatibility. But try and remove those privileges from those groups if you can, if they're not being used. And if necessary, you can also exclude 4 groups from the admin SD holder role if you decide to retire those groups and essentially make them null and void. So finally, I just want to talk about the protected users group. Now this works in Windows Server 2012 R2 and later, and basically the main thing that it does is it blocks credentials from being cached on devices. So for instance, if a domain administrator was to log into an end user workstation, their credentials get cached, and we don't want that to happen. We don't want the hacker being able to harvest those credentials and move across to a domain controller. So the idea of this is to block those caching mechanisms on Windows. It's important to note there, it only works with Windows 8.1 and higher, because obviously a lot of you are going to have Windows 7 in your environments, so protected users isn't going to help you in this case. But you might add, of course, your domain administrators to the protected users group just to give you an extra level of protection, especially if you don't plan to empty out your privileged AD groups or use the tiered administrative model. Now, it's not the only thing that protected users group does. There are other things like stopping NTLM logons, which is the legacy protocol for Microsoft, and there are other things as well that it does, got a whole list of protections. But these are the main things. But you might be asking yourself, well, okay, so why isn't it enough then just to add my domain administrators to the protected users group and have done with it? Why do I need all these other protections? Because it only provides partial protection. So it might be able to stop a hacker from harvesting the credentials from memory in principle, but it can't protect against other types of attack. So for instance, if a user has an infected machine and the keylogger has got on there, and then the domain admin logs onto that device, the protected users group isn't going to stop you from having those credentials hacked out through a keylogger, for instance. Okay, so I hope that's given you an idea about the tiered administrative model and how you might implement it in your environment to separate the administration of high-risk devices like domain controllers and devices that might be easily hacked like workstations and other devices that users log on to interactively. So now I'm going to hand over to Jason and he's going to give you a demo.
Thank you very much. All right, as always, any little peace of mind, make sure that A, you can hear me, and B, I'm sharing a screen. What screen do you see, Russell?
I see the asset screen.
Fantastic. I'll get to that in just a moment. All right, so I'm just going to show a couple of slides. I'm not a big fan, so I'd rather do some demos here. Basically, I'm going to talk a little bit about PowerBroker for Windows. Russell spent a lot of time chatting about protecting privileged accounts, and absolutely, we all really should be doing this. The trick, of course, is how do you do that? Microsoft offers a lot of built-in functionality to do it. It can work for some cases, and then you sort of branch out and you find that it is kind of complicated to not just set up but maintain going forward. Well, I have Windows, I have Unix, I have Mac in my environment. What do I do for those? You'd want to kind of do the same sort of umbrella products to sort of manage all of that. My focus, like I said on the screen here, is PowerBroker for Windows. It's the least privilege tool. Basically, what it allows you to do is log on as a standard user, whether that be to a client OS or a Windows sort of server OS, log on without admin rights, but still get your job done. So all this protecting of privileged accounts becomes a lot easier because much less people actually have log-on ability with a privileged account in the first place. So I'll show a couple of applications running. I'll show them with and without a rule. I'll show a couple of applications running actually with as another person. If I had the credentials for a privileged account, I would go through this process of doing a run as, but that still means I need to have those credentials. I'll show a way to get that done without ever knowing what the credentials are. And of course, I'm the only one that would be able to use those credentials in the first place, and they get cycled around and all that kind of fun stuff as well. So why PowerBroker for Windows? So you'll see this as we go, but I'll read a little bit here. Deep capability. We do allow the ability to discover what machines you have out there in the wild. So, if something is touching the network, you're going to want to know about it. Again, whether that be a Windows device, a networking device, a Cisco router, phone equipment, if it has an IP address and I can reach it, that means it can reach me. I want to know it's at least there. I may not be intending to manage all of the user profiles, all the people that log on to it, but I at least want to know it's there. Anything that touches the environment can be a potential attack vector. So let's go find that stuff out. We do have built-in application control. So while the main purpose is to log on as a standard user, you need to run an installer, you need to run a business application. It may require elevated rights. No problem. I'll make sure it works even though you don't have those rights. We talk about risk compliance a little bit. Really, that's the ability to say, I may trust the application. It may be an application, even if it needs elevated rights. I may have a rule that says it's absolutely fine, but at some point it may become vulnerable. We may understand that there is an attack vector, an exploit that can be taken advantage of. Well, we track all of that, so we can track that inside PowerBroker for Windows as well. and then stop it in its tracks. It's become too risky of an application. You know, as a person, I didn't realize I no longer trusted it, but the software knows at some point it may become untrustworthy. So just stop it in its tracks from running. At the very least, alert you that this application has now become vulnerable. Event logging, all that kind of stuff. We do have some patents on this stuff I'm about to show you as well. And of course, reporting, everybody asks, that's all well and good. I understand the concept, but how do I know what kind of rules or policy do I even need? We'll help you with that as well. So just get into it kind of real quick, and we'll go back to a poll. So I'm just logged into a Windows 10 box here, and I have a lot of what I need to do to show you guys kind of running on the same machine. It's essentially its own little jump host. So I'm logged in as a standard user. And if I'm going to try to go run something as simple as ODBC, now as a standard user, I can open the application just fine. Here again, though, the problem becomes if I try to do something inside the application. I can't create a data source name that is saved for everyone that logs onto the box. I can't create a system DSN. But maybe I need to. Maybe this user, whoever this user is, this person needs to be able to do this function, whatever that function happens to be. So I'm going to let the person do that. Or I want to try to run something like Process Monitor. Pretty common application. It needs elevated rights to even open up. So I have a few options here. So if I wanted to centralize, I want to put this Power Broker for Windows client out there and then just sort of discover what kind of things are my users doing, that so I can understand that behavior. So if I decided to remove those administrative rights they very likely have now, then what kind of rules would I need? That's where this Beyond Insight comes in. Beyond Insight is just part of Power Broker for Windows. It's actually, and if you buy any of the software from Beyond Trust, it just comes with it on the back end. It's software install, appliance-based, however you need it to work in your environment. But it's listening for all these things that, in this case, Power Broker for Windows is telling it. I know that I ran Procmon. And oh, by the way, when I ran Procmon, UAC prompted for it. I know that I ran ODBC. When I ran it, you know, it doesn't really prompt UAC, but there is a discovery mechanism to say, yeah, that just ran. You know it didn't run properly because you tried to do something and it failed on you. I'll let you make a rule for that as well. If I want a rule for something, I just simply tell the software, make me a rule for this thing, right? There's a little action button here. What kind of rule do you want? Do you want me to base a rule that if an application signed by, in this case, Microsoft with this original file name, if I care about the version, basically, if this thing happens again, you want me to just let it run? I'm not going to change the rights of the user, but I'll give the application itself the rights it needs to launch properly or run or update or an ActiveX install, whatever it might be. So if I had one, like in this case, or if I had 10,000 machines, it's all going to centralize into this reporting backend. It's just SQL Server IIS on top of it, so nothing real fancy going on there. It's just a nice way to know what do I need to do next to make sure that my users can run properly. The other option is more locally. Right? I'm on this machine right now. I don't necessarily need to shell out and go to this back-end Beyond Insight website. I can just look at that data right here as well. It may not look as pretty as a nice little Beyond Insight, but it does the job really, really well. And that's really just what happened. What just happened that I need to account for? Well, I can see right here a little bit earlier, I ran ODBC. All right, well, what if a rule existed already? I ran ODBC without any type of policy, you know, related to that application. But what if it ran with a rule? Well, let's say I wanted a publish rule or a path rule or a hash rule. Let's say I wanted to get kind of easy and just say, hey, you know what, just give it admin rights. Basically, give it everything you can. Or if I wanted to make it a little more, a little bit tighter on the privileges that I might grant this application, I can do that as well. Either way, I'll just run the application again. Go ahead and launch it. Same application just ran. This time, though, system DSN doesn't fail. Great. Now I want that rule. Go ahead. I need this rule to actually live in my environment. All right. Just copy that right there. And I'm going to put it into my policy. This is the management platform for Power Broker for Windows. It comes in 3 different modes. The mode I'm using right now is what we refer to as web services. Essentially, that Beyond Insight database I just showed you, that rule that I just created is saved inside the database. my clients check home to it at, if there's a default time. You can always change it, of course. So when it pulls down this new policy, a rule for that ODBC editor will now exist. If I want to take a look at that actual rule itself, most times if I'm elevating something, I don't necessarily care that it's version 15 or 16 or 17, so I usually call that guy out of there. You want to change the name of the application, of the rule itself, I encourage that. I always like to name my rules what the intention of the rule was supposed to be. In this case, I want to elevate that EXE. Maybe I wanted to deny something. Maybe I wanted to passively allow something. Either way, it's nice when you're looking at things to know what was it supposed to do and what actually happened. After that, it's just a matter of saying, okay, if you see this application, exactly what do you want me to do? In most cases, I just want you to give it more rights than it had before. The user's rights will stay the same. There'll always be a standard user in this case. But the application will now behave as if I dropped it into the admin security group. Can't really do that in Windows, but with the software, you can make it behave as if you did. Same thing with Procmon. If I want to go over here and see when I ran this Procmon application, I would do the same thing. I know that UAC hit it. Go over here, paste it right in. Same kind of deal. I chose to use a publisher rule. There are some things I might not care about. The version, may not care at all about the arguments that were launched, that were used at that exact launch. Pull those out, no problem at all. Change the name of the rule. Whatever I want to do for this applications, I can. But now we get to the other side of it. What about those applications that are, their elevation is required remotely, right? All those things where, some people have a privileged account and you feel they're going to need it forevermore because they do very complex, very low-level sort of system task kind of things, or they're in ADUC, or they're in GPMC directly. Well, if I go over here to a couple of the RSAT tools I have saved off, and I open up users and computers, I do a little browse, and I'll open up this little guy right here. I can't make any changes. I'm hitting a little harder than I normally on the keyboard because you can't see what I'm doing, but I'm trying to type in something, anything at all, to the Office, attribute for this guy. The problem is I ran users and computers with just standard user rights. Okay, well, I have a couple of options. I can always do a run as. And if I know what those credentials are, it'll work just fine. But I don't want the users to know what those credentials are. I want this to work just by double-clicking it and let the user move on. So I'm going to turn on a couple of rules here. I have this collection, this folder here, disabled. And what I have inside there is a set of, in this case, MMC, style things. They all do the same thing, though, right? If I run any of those, they're not going to run as the logged on user. They're actually going to run as an administrative user, as a real privileged user account. But the reason I'm not going to need to know what those credentials are is because combined with PowerBroker for Windows, we'll give you a couple of licenses for this, but we have a full suite like called Password Safe. It does way more than what Laps is going to do, but for Windows and Unix and Linux and Mac, all this kind of stuff. But I'm going to use it here at a much smaller scale. I just want to tell this Password Safe product, look, there's an account called ADM and then whatever my username is. In this case, it's INDAB. So she has an ADM account that is a native domain admin in my case. I don't want to give her the credentials for that account because I don't want her using it anywhere else. But in this case, in this only case, I'm going to let it happen. So now that it's enabled, I'm going to go ahead and update my policy. Basically, I just saved it up into Beyond Insight. This would happen on its own as well, but I'm asking the PowerBroker for Windows software, go check to see if you have anything else. Is there another rule or some rules might be removed, whatever it might be. Just go find out and pull those things down. It's much like doing a GP update. I'm just not talking to group policy in this case because that's not the mode I'm in, although there is a group policy mode. I'm talking to Beyond Insight itself. So I'll give that a second to find out that everything's saved in. There we go. There's my new policy. So now when I do the same activity, call ADUC again, it's retrieving, you probably didn't see it that well. There's a little screen that came up and says, fine, I'm retrieving the credentials for that ADM, into B account. Now when I come in here and I look at my line of businesses, I was in engineering. Now I can do whatever I want. the auditing, that I know that the only person that is able to use the account that is running users and computers right now is this person. And because she's the only one that has access to it. If somebody else logged into the system and did that same activity, I would use a different account. You're welcome to use a shared account as well. In some cases, that's absolutely fine. But in my case, I wanted to have that auditability of knowing there's a one-to-one relationship between a human being and a privileged account. So we allow for all that as well. All right, there's more to it, obviously, but it's always a little tough without getting some questions back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this demo stuff here. Let me go back to this right here. Sarah, I know you want to do a little poll here, given the idea of what was talked about earlier in the webinar, which is always great to know that, what do I have access now just out of the box from Microsoft, and then what can I do to sort of complement that? Any questions on any of this?
Great. So you guys, if you have questions for Jason or for Russell, please submit them right now in the chat box. In the meantime, you should see a quick poll up on your screen. Just based on what Jason showed you, he had a little bit more time today than normal to run through some brief demoing, but there's so much more to show. And so if you'd like a personalized one-on-one demo with a Beyond Trust security engineer or rep, please select yes, and they will be in contact with you to schedule that demo or even just a further conversation. So let's go ahead and jump in. Jason, this came in for you while you were demoing just a minute ago. So where are the credentials saved?
So it's not a matter of saving credentials. Password safe itself is actually on an enclave. The credentials are actually played in. So the credentials don't actually get saved locally. There's actually sort of a bastion host. We call it password safe, call it Beyond Insight. That's where the credentials actually are. I'm just using PowerBroker for Windows as my authoritative source that says I'm allowed to use those and I need those right now. And then when I'm done, this password safe can actually cycle those credentials back. So even though I never knew what they were, they get changed anyway.
Russell, this popped in for you while you were speaking. Are there any effective technical controls to prevent Tier 0 accounts from accessing Tier 1 or 2 machines?
Yes. Of course, you can, if you want, you can restrict logon to devices in different tiers with the help of group policy. It's not a problem.
Another one for you, Russell. Will be credential artifacts, let's see if I can get this. Okay, will the credential artifacts be left on a Tier 2 system if a Tier 0 admin logs on to Tier 2 system using command prompt?
I'm not quite sure what they mean by command prompt. If they mean like an interactive logon, then yes, they would be.
Sunil, if you are still on the line and you can clarify that question, we can come back to it. Another one for you, Russell. I have looked into this tiered model and Microsoft ESAE. Do you agree that it is not easy to achieve the desired level of security because there are so many moving parts? As long as you have made one or a few mistakes, then the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah, I mean, it's a case of following the best practices laid out by Microsoft very, very carefully. But I think if you go back, if you remember the privileged account roadmap that I laid out and the 3 different phases, I think stuff in the first phase, probably almost any organization can probably achieve. But what's interesting about that is that most of those basic security best practices, let's say, many organizations don't even achieve those. If you're talking about the tiered administration model and the ESAE administrative model that Microsoft has, they're very complex, and there are, as he said, there are so many moving parts. You just one slip up and the whole thing comes tumbling down. Of course, yeah. So it needs to be very strictly controlled. But start with phase 1 stuff, and you can really you can get some real results there, I think, quite easily.
To mitigate pass-the-hash threat, do you think using a password vaulting with one-time password would be an effective measure comparing with the MSESAE? It seems much easier.
Well, once a hash or a token, has been assigned, it stays valid for a certain period of time. So using a password vault isn't necessarily going to stop those kinds of attacks. It might help mitigate them to a certain extent, but stop them in their tracks completely, probably not. So again, it really depends, you need to set out what it is that you're trying to achieve, and what is realistic, and what are the threats, and decide, is a password vault, is it going to help you or not?
Okay, we got clarification for that one question, Russell. Will the credential artifacts be left on a Tier 2 system if a Tier 1 admin logs on to Tier 2 system using PowerShell remoting?
Oh, okay, right, using PowerShell remoting. To be honest, I don't know the answer to that, but I could try and find it out and get back to whoever posed the question.
Okay, we'll definitely get back to you. Hi, Jason. What if we want to run the application as a regular user? What should be done? For example, you said ADA can open up and be run as a privileged user.
So if you want to run it as a regular user, just don't make a rule on it, right? So if you don't put a rule on an application, whether by its path, its publisher, its hash even, then it's just going to run as whatever user you're logged in as. I think that's what you're asking. So the answer is do nothing, and then it'll run as whoever you are with whatever rights you have if you don't put a rule on it. I hope that's what you asked.
Okay, I think this is coming in for Russell. How long does it typically take to implement tiered model?
Oh, a long time, because you need to test all of that in a pre-production lab. You need to test the access that every user and device is going to get. It's a huge amount of planning. You could probably, of course, depending on the complexity of your environment, you could be testing that for 6 months, 1 year before you were ready to roll it over into production. So, of course, it depends on the environment that you're trying to secure, but a lot of testing required.
Okay, thanks for all your questions, everybody. We really appreciate it. You've got a live expert here, so thank you for leveraging that and asking your questions. So I did also receive a couple of questions asking about follow-up and the PowerPoint and the slides and the recording. Yes, you will be receiving a link to both the PowerPoint slides, and you can also find them in the handout section right now in GoToWebinar, and you'll also receive an email with a link to the recording. So be on the lookout for that follow-up within 1 to 2 business days from now, and it will come from communications@beyondtrust.com. So Russell, Jason, thank you guys so much for being here today. We really appreciate your expertise and running us through all this stuff. We really appreciate it. And thanks everybody else for joining. We will see you at our next webinar. Take care, everybody, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.